"Who do you think you are, questioning me like that?" The older man barked, his voice sharp and indignant. I didn't flinch, keeping my gaze steady as I replied. "Mr. Nguyen," I said, my tone measured, "I'm here to help you. But if you want my help, I need the whole picture, every detail." He exhaled sharply, his pride clearly bruised, but he didn't argue further. For a moment, he looked away, shaking his head. "My name is Danielle, which is the name I chose for myself when I was a kid. I'm a 30-year-old attorney. I never carried my family's last name. I created my own. I built my career on resilience, channeling the pain of my past into a drive to succeed. When I was 6 years old, my parents abandoned me at an orphanage, leaving me to piece together a life without them. They walked away without a second glance, leaving me to wonder what I had done wrong, why I wasn't enough. Now, decades later, the very people who discarded me are sitting in my office, begging for legal counsel, and they have no idea who I am. I was 6 years old the last time I saw them. My mom had dressed me in my nicest outfit that morning, a yellow dress with little white daisies, and told me we were going somewhere special. I remember holding her hand tightly as we walked into the orphanage, the bright sunlight outside contrasting with the dimly lit hallways inside. The air smelled of cleaning supplies and something else I couldn't place, something cold, like emptiness. She knelt down in front of me, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You'll love it here," she said, her voice soft but hollow. "They'll take such good care of you." I didn't understand what she meant. "When are you coming back?" I asked, my small hands clutching hers. She hesitated, her eyes darting away before she forced a smile. "Soon, sweetheart. Be good, okay?" I didn't cry as she walked away. I just stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to swing open again. But it didn't. Hours passed, then days, before I realized she wasn't coming back. That was the day I learned what it meant to be alone. The orphanage became my world, a place where I quickly learned that survival meant toughness. I stopped asking why my parents didn't come back. The other kids didn't want to hear it, and the caretakers didn't have answers. Instead, I focused on what I could control, my studies. Books became my escape, a place where I could lose myself in stories far from the sterile walls of the orphanage. I promised myself I'd be better, smarter, stronger than anyone who thought I wasn't worth keeping. But the nights were the hardest. Alone in my bunk, I'd stare at the ceiling, wondering what I had done to make them leave me. Did I cry too much? Was I not helpful enough? Every question became fuel for the fire inside me, a fire that burned to prove, even if only to myself, that I was enough. I would show them. Somehow, someway, I would show the world that I wasn't the useless girl they thought I was. It wasn't until years later that I learned the truth about why they left me there. The orphanage director, a kind but overworked woman named Mrs. Patel, pulled me aside when I was about 10. She had been there the day my parents dropped me off, and she had always seemed to feel sorry for me in a way I didn't fully understand. "Danielle," she said gently, sitting me down in her small, cluttered office. "You're old enough now to know why your parents brought you here." Her voice was kind, but her words hit like a knife. Your parents, they came from a very traditional background. When your little brother was born, they believed it was their duty to focus all their attention and resources on him as the family's heir. I stared at her, the words sinking in like stones. "But I'm their daughter," I said, my voice trembling. "Why didn't they want me too?" Mrs. Patel sighed, her eyes filled with sympathy. "It's not about what you did or didn't do, Danielle. It's about them and their beliefs. It's wrong, so very wrong, but they thought they were doing what was expected of them." That night, as I lay in bed, the reality of their rejection hit me in full force. They hadn't left me because of anything I did. They left me because of who I was. A girl. A girl who, to them, wasn't worth keeping. After that conversation, something in me shifted. I stopped asking why they left and started focusing on what I could do to move forward. The rejection that once crushed me became my fuel. At school, I threw myself into every subject, determined to be the best. I stayed late to read in the library, poring over books that stretched my imagination and taught me about a world far bigger than the orphanage. By the time I was 16, I was winning academic competitions and earning recognition from teachers who saw my potential. Danielle, one of them, told me, "You could go far, you just need the right opportunities." Those words planted a seed of hope in me. I started applying for scholarships with a single goal in mind, to get into a good university and prove to myself that I could rise above the circumstances I was born into. When the acceptance letter from a prestigious school arrived, I held it in my hands like it was a golden ticket. It wasn't just a chance to study, it was my way out. The orphanage threw a small party in my honor, and Mrs. Patel, who had always been my quiet supporter, hugged me tightly. "You've earned this, Danielle," she said. "Now go show the world what you can do." College was a whirlwind. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who believed in me, or at least respected what I brought to the table. My professors noticed my drive, and my peers were drawn to my focus and determination. I took every opportunity that came my way: internships, leadership roles, and study groups that pushed me to the limit. Law school followed, and while it was grueling, I thrived on the challenge. I learned to channel my emotions into my work, using my own story to connect with the cases I studied. I knew what it was like to feel powerless, and I wanted to make sure others didn't have to feel the same. By the time I graduated, I had offers from some of the best firms in the country. I chose a firm in New York that specialized in helping underserved communities, a place where I could make a difference while building my career. Through it all, I kept my past a secret. It wasn't out of shame. I had nothing to be ashamed of, but because I wanted people to see me for who I was now, not the girl who had been left behind. Every step I took felt like a victory, a reminder that I had become someone my younger self could be proud of. It was during my second year at the firm that I met Mark. He was one of the attorneys on a joint case we worked, a complicated mess involving housing rights. At first, he was just another name in a sea of professionals, but as the weeks went on, I couldn't help but notice his warmth and sharp sense of humor. He had a way of making even the most stressful days feel a little lighter. Our relationship started slowly, almost unintentionally. Late nights at the office turned into shared dinners, and casual conversations about work became deeper talks about life. I was hesitant at first. I'd spent so long building walls to protect myself that letting someone in felt risky. But Mark was patient, never pushing me to share more than I was ready to. One night, after we'd won the case, he walked me home. "You know," he said as we stood by my apartment door, "I think you're the most driven person I've ever met. But sometimes it's okay to let someone else carry a little of that weight." His words stayed with me long after he left, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe I didn't have to do everything alone. As things between Mark and me grew more serious, we started talking about the future, what we wanted in life, where we saw ourselves in 5 or 10 years. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine having a family, something I had avoided thinking about for so long. Mark wanted kids, and so did I, though the thought scared me. I didn't want to repeat the mistakes my parents had made. But with him, it felt possible. It didn't take long for us to realize that building the life we dreamed of would require more than just hard work. Between student loans, rent, and the cost of living in New York, our combined incomes were stretched thin. We both worked long hours, but the idea of starting a family someday made the financial gap seem even larger. Mark was supportive, always reminding me that we were a team. "We'll figure it out together," he said one night as we pored over budgets and savings plans at the kitchen table. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do more, to push myself even harder to ensure our future was secure. I loved my work at the firm, helping people who felt powerless, using the law to stand up for those who couldn't fight for themselves. It gave me purpose. But the truth was, it didn't pay much. Mark and I weren't struggling, but we weren't building the kind of financial security we needed to start a family either. And as much as I cared about my clients and the mission of the firm, I knew I couldn't ignore the practical side of things forever. One evening, as I reviewed my growing list of cases, I realized something had to change. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd spent years carving out a place for myself in the world of public interest law, but the more I thought about it, the more I knew it was time to move on. I needed to think about the future, not just mine, but ours. Over dinner that night, I told Mark what was on my mind. "I've been thinking," I said, swirling my fork in my pasta, "about applying to some bigger firms. Corporate law, maybe." He looked at me with a mix of surprise and concern. "Are you sure? I know how much you love what you're doing now." "I do," I admitted, "but it's not enough. If we want to start a family someday, we need to plan for it. I want to give our kids the kind of stability I didn't have growing up." He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "If it's what you want, I'm with you," he said simply. "I know you'll succeed anywhere." As I updated my resume and started researching bigger firms, another thought began creeping into my mind, one I'd spent years pushing away. My family, the people who had abandoned me. I told myself I didn't need them, that I was better off without them in my life. But now, with the prospect of starting my own family, I found myself wondering, who were they? What kind of life had they built without me? I didn't know much about them, just fragments of stories I'd pieced together over the years. Mrs. Patel had once mentioned that they were wealthy, part of a prominent community. That fact had always stung. They hadn't left me because they couldn't afford to raise me. They left me because they didn't want me. The bitterness was hard to shake, but curiosity had started to outweigh the pain. I needed to know more. The next day, I called the orphanage. Mrs. Patel had retired years ago, but the new director, a woman named Claire, was kind and eager to help. "We still have some of your records," she said. "Why don't you come by? Maybe we can talk about what you're looking for." I agreed, my stomach tightening as I hung up the phone. I wasn't sure what I'd find, but I knew I had to take the first step. A few days later, I found myself walking through the familiar gates of the orphanage. It had been years since I'd last been there, but the sight of the weathered brick walls and the faint sound of children playing in the distance brought back a flood of memories. Claire, the director, greeted me warmly, a kind smile putting me at ease. "Come on in, Danielle," she said, leading me to her office. I pulled some files I thought might be helpful. We sat down, and she placed a thin folder on the desk between us. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, scanning through the pages of handwritten notes and forms from when I was first admitted. "Your parents," Claire began gently, "they came from a very well-off family. From what I can gather, they owned several businesses and had a prominent position in their community." She paused, gauging my reaction. "They didn't leave you because of financial hardship." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a blow. "Do you have anything else about them?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Claire hesitated before sliding a photocopy of a newspaper article across the desk. It was a feature on the Thien family, a story about their success, their growing company, and their perfect, polished life. There was a photo of them. My parents, older now but unmistakable, stood proudly next to a young man I knew had to be my brother. They looked so complete, so whole, like I had never existed. After leaving the orphanage that day, I felt like I'd been split in two. One part of me was desperate for answers, while the other screamed to let it go. What good would it do to dig up the past? They'd made their choice and I'd made mine. I had worked too hard to let their rejection define me any longer. I shoved the folder of information into a drawer at home and decided to focus on my future instead. A few weeks later, my efforts paid off. I received an offer from a top corporate law firm, exactly the kind of job that could provide the stability I needed to start the life, Mark, and I had been dreaming of. The pay was incredible, and the opportunity to work on high-profile cases was everything I'd hoped for. When I told Mark, his face lit up with pride. "I knew you'd get it," he said, pulling me into a hug. "You deserve this, Danielle." I threw myself into the new role, determined to prove myself all over again. The work was challenging, and I thrived on the pressure. Long hours in the office left little time to dwell on my family or the questions I'd left unanswered. For a while, it seemed like I'd made the right choice, leaving the past where it belonged. A couple of years passed, and life changed in ways I hadn't imagined. Mark and I welcomed our daughter, Mia, into the world, a tiny, perfect bundle of joy who turned our lives upside down in the best possible way. Becoming a mother brought out a side of me I didn't know I had. I wanted to give Mia everything I hadn't had growing up: unconditional love, security, and the unwavering knowledge that she was wanted. At the same time, my career was flourishing. I had become one of the youngest senior attorneys at the firm, handling major clients and earning a reputation for my precision and drive. The long hours were still there, but with Mia waiting for me at home, I found a new balance. Mark was my rock, stepping in whenever I needed to stay late or prepare for a big case. We were building the life we had dreamed of, one built on mutual respect and love. And yet, every so often in the quiet moments when I'd rock Mia to sleep, a shadow of the past would creep in. I'd think about the choices my parents had made, about how they had left me behind without a second thought. Holding Mia in my arms, I couldn't fathom how anyone could do that to their child. I pushed the thoughts away, telling myself it didn't matter. I had my family now, the one I had chosen, the one that mattered. One morning, I walked into my office, coffee in hand, ready to dive into another packed day of meetings and case prep. My assistant knocked lightly on the door just as I was sitting down. "Danielle," she said with a bright smile. "Mr. Roberts wants to see you in his office. He said it's about a new client." I set my coffee down and straightened my blazer, curiosity piqued. New clients were always an exciting challenge, and I prided myself on being the firm's go-to for high-stakes cases. As I stepped into Mr. Roberts' office, he looked up from a stack of papers and gestured for me to sit. "Good morning, Danielle," he began, leaning back in his chair. "We've taken on a significant new client. It's a bit of a complicated case: financial mismanagement, lawsuits, potential bankruptcy. High profile but discreet, and I think you're the right person for the job." He slid a file across the desk toward me. "This one's all yours." I picked up the folder and flipped it open, scanning the top page. The name at the top made my heart stop. Yuan Holdings. My parents' business. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the familiar name, the memories of the orphanage, and that faded newspaper article rushing back all at once. I looked up at Mr. Roberts, struggling to keep my face neutral. "Thank you," I said evenly. "I'll get started right away." I walked back to my office in a daze, clutching the folder like it might vanish if I let it go. My mind raced, a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite pin down. Anger, confusion, curiosity. They all swirled together, leaving me breathless. I closed the door behind me and sat down at my desk, staring at the name on the file. Yuan Holdings, my parents' company. For a long time, I didn't move. I just sat there, torn between the instinct to shove the file into a drawer and forget it existed, or to dive into every detail and see how far they had fallen. What were the odds that after all these years, they'd end up in my office, needing my help? The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my whole life trying to forget them, and now they were here, on paper, at least, intruding on the life I had built for myself. After a moment of hesitation, I opened the folder. If I was going to handle this case, or decide not to, I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. The first few pages outlined the basic facts. Yuan Holdings was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, entangled in multiple lawsuits from creditors, partners, and even former employees. It was a financial disaster, the kind that screamed of neglect and mismanagement. As I delved deeper into the documents, one name kept appearing. Banyuan, my brother, the special one, the golden child they had chosen over me. Apparently, he had been handed the reins of the company a few years ago and had driven it straight into the ground. Misguided investments, failure to adapt to market trends, and reckless spending had left the business in shambles. Every page I read felt like a punch to the gut. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a shaky breath. It was almost poetic, really. The family that had thrown me away to prioritize their son now sat on the edge of ruin because of him. And here I was, their last hope. The one person who could potentially save them. The irony was as sharp as a blade, cutting through the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. That evening, I walked through the door, still holding the folder like it might slip through my fingers. Mark was in the kitchen, bouncing Mia on his hip, while stirring a pot on the stove. The smell of dinner should have been comforting, but I felt too unsettled to notice. "You're home early," he said with a warm smile, glancing at me. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, placing the folder on the counter. "Not really," I admitted. "There's something big I need to tell you." He immediately set Mia down in her playpen and turned to face me, concern etched on his face. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath and told him everything. The new client, the name on the file, the history I had spent so many years trying to leave behind. As I spoke, his expression shifted, from surprise to disbelief, and finally to understanding. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "The family who abandoned you is now sitting in financial ruin, and their survival depends on you." "Pretty much," I said, crossing my arms and leaning against the counter. "It's surreal, isn't it?" Mark shook his head, his brow furrowed. "What are you going to do? Are you even considering taking the case?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I can't just ignore it. I think I need to meet with them. See what they're like now. Maybe it'll help me figure out what to do." Mark nodded slowly, leaning against the counter across from me. "That's fair. You've always been the kind of person who faces things head-on." He paused, his gaze steady. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" I asked. "Do what's best for you," he said. "Not for them. Not for anyone else. You don't owe them anything, Danielle. If you decide to take this case, it has to be on your terms." His words hit me hard, but I nodded. "I'll keep that in mind," I said quietly. "The meeting's tomorrow. After that, I'll decide." Mark walked over and pulled me into a hug, his arms a steady anchor against the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "No matter what you choose," he murmured, "I've got your back." The meeting. The next morning, I sat at my desk, staring at the phone for what felt like an eternity. My assistant had already reached out to Yuan Holdings to arrange the meeting, and they had agreed almost immediately. Now, all that was left was to confirm the time. I took a deep breath, picked up the receiver, and dialed. A woman's voice answered on the other end. "Yuan Holdings, how may I direct your call?" "This is Danielle from Cross and Roberts," I said, keeping my tone professional. "I'd like to confirm the meeting scheduled for tomorrow with Mr. Yuan." "Of course," she replied cheerfully. "Mr. Yuan and Mr. Bao Yuan will be there at 11 o'clock a.m. Does that work for you?" My grip on the phone tightened at the mention of Beau's name. "Yes, that works perfectly," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Thank you." As I hung up, my stomach churned. It was set. In less than 24 hours, I would be sitting face to face with the family who had left me behind. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. No matter how this meeting went, I knew one thing. I was ready to face them. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced with every possible scenario. What would I say? How would they react? Would they even recognize me? Every time I closed my eyes, their faces from that newspaper article flashed in my mind, older but unmistakable. By the time my alarm went off, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The next morning, I got ready with a focus that was almost robotic, carefully selecting a sleek black suit and pulling my hair into a neat bun. I wanted to project confidence, even if I felt anything but. As I walked into the conference room at 10:50 a.m., I gave myself one last mental pep talk. "You've faced tougher challenges, Danielle. You can do this." At exactly 11 o'clock a.m., the door opened, and they walked in. My father was first, looking every bit as proud and authoritative as I remembered. Behind him was Bay. His features were sharper than in the photos, but he still carried that same air of privilege. Neither of them gave me a second glance as they approached the table. "Miss Danielle, thank you for meeting with us," my father said, extending his hand. His voice was polite, professional, utterly devoid of recognition. I shook his hand firmly, my own composure flawless. Of course, I replied evenly, "Please have a seat." As they settled in, I opened the folder in front of me, flipping through the pages with deliberate calm. "Let's get right to it," I said, my tone sharp and professional. "From what I've reviewed so far, Yuan Holdings is in a precarious financial situation. Years of mismanagement, reckless investments, and mounting lawsuits have left the company on the brink of bankruptcy. I just couldn't resist." My father stiffened, his face flushed, and I could see the pride and anger building behind his composed exterior. Finally, he snapped. "Who do you think you are, questioning me like that?" He barked, his voice echoing through the room. For a moment, I just stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He had no idea who I was. No idea that the person sitting across from him was the same little girl he had deemed unworthy all those years ago. And now I was the one holding his fate in my hands. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Another part of me wanted to scream. He doesn't even recognize me. He doesn't see the person I've become. The person who's now in control of what happens next. So now I ask you, what would you do if you were me? Would you confront him right here and now, rip off the mask and force him to see the truth? See the daughter he abandoned standing before him, stronger than he ever gave her credit for? Would you take the case and prove that I'm better than them? That I can save the empire they destroyed, just to show them I could? Or would you walk away, leave them to deal with the mess they and their golden child created? And then there's another thought that keeps creeping in. Should I ruin them for good? Should I let their empire crumble and watch them feel the pain they once made me endure? Is that justice? Or is that revenge? I don't know anymore. All I know is that whatever I decide will change everything. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm still deciding, and maybe your perspective will help me figure out how this story ends. And hey, if you liked this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps us a lot, and makes sure you won't miss out on more great stories we share here. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.